I want to tell you something about trust. Not the word. Everybody uses the word. But the actual thing. The living practice of it. The daily decision to not look too closely. To not ask the question you already half know the answer to. To extend to another human being the same good faith you'd want extended to you. I built my entire adult life around that practice. 31 years on the factory floor in Wolverhampton, supervising men whose names I knew, whose kids I knew, whose Saturday football scores I knew, and trust was the currency everything ran on. You trust the man next to you to do his job right because if he doesn't, someone gets hurt. That's not a soft idea. That's structural. It keeps things standing. I brought that same principle to Pattaya, to a woman named Kratae, to a joint savings account containing £290,000. Every pound I had earned or saved or been awarded across 31 years of shifts that started at 6 in the morning and ended whenever the line needed me. And I want to be honest with you now, in a way I wasn't able to be honest with myself then. I knew, somewhere in the machinery of me, that something was wrong. I knew it for months before the ATM told me. I just chose not to ask, because asking felt like a betrayal, because I thought trust meant not asking. I know now that I had it entirely backwards. Trust without verification isn't virtue. It's an open door with a sign that says, please help yourself. I'm Thomas. I'm 68. This is what happened. I spent my working life in the same factory my uncle got me into at 17. A pressed metal plant outside Wolverhampton that made components for the automotive industry. The kind of place that smelled of machine oil and hot metal, and the particular exhaustion of men who use their bodies for a living. I worked my way up from the floor to supervisor by the time I was 32, and I stayed a supervisor for the rest of my career because I was good at it, and because I had no appetite for the kind of politics that got you further than that. I wasn't ambitious in the way ambitious people describe themselves. I was steady. I was consistent. I showed up. The factory closed in 2018 as part of a restructuring that had been coming for years, and I received a redundancy package of £84,000 on top of a pension that had been building since I was 23, and which paid out a lump sum of £206,000 when I took it the following year. £290,000 in total. It wasn't a fortune. But for a man who'd grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Bilston with a father who worked a second job on weekends, it felt like an extraordinary amount. I was a widower. My wife, Christine, had died in 2016. Breast cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. The kind of timeline that doesn't leave enough room for anything except being present. We'd been married for 29 years. We hadn't been perfect together, because nobody is. But we had been genuinely happy, in the way that long marriages sometimes produce happiness. Not the dramatic kind, but the accumulated kind. Built from thousands of ordinary days that only look important in retrospect. After she died, I carried on working because there was nothing else to do. And when the factory closed 2 years later, it took away the last structure holding my days together. I had money and time, and a house in Wolverhampton that was very quiet, and I did not know what to do with any of it. My daughter, Lisa, suggested Thailand. This surprised me because Lisa is not the sort to suggest unconventional things. But she'd been reading about retirement options and the cost of living in Southeast Asia, and she showed me some figures that were genuinely striking. I could live comfortably in Thailand on £1,200 a month. Comfortably in a way that would cost 3 times that in the Midlands. She wasn't suggesting I leave forever. She suggested a trial. 6 months, see how it suited me. I booked the flights in January 2020, and then the pandemic canceled everything. And then I booked again in March 2022, and this time I went. I arrived in Bangkok and spent 2 weeks acclimatizing, doing the tourist things, eating at street stalls, walking until my feet ached, discovering that the heat at midday in March was something my body needed about a week to accept. I took the bus to Pattaya because an online forum for British expats had described it as having a large established community of retirees, good hospitals, accessible transport, and an infrastructure built around the needs of Western residents. All of that was true. What the forum post was somewhat circumspect about was the nature of the entertainment industry that forms the other half of Pattaya's economy. But I was 66 years old, and I wasn't naive. and I rented a modest apartment near Jomtien Beach rather than in the walking street area, because I wanted quiet rather than spectacle. I met Kratae in May, at a small restaurant near the Theprasit night market that a neighbor in my building had recommended for its pad krapao. She was waiting tables. She was 33, though she looked younger, with a directness that I found immediately appealing. She didn't perform warmth the way some service workers do. She was simply competent and occasionally funny, in a dry way that required you to be paying attention. I went back 3 times that week. On the 4th visit, she sat down at my table during a quiet period and asked me what I'd been doing in Pattaya for a month, and we talked for an hour. She told me she was from a village near Buriram, in the Isan region of northeastern Thailand, the 7th of 8 children in a farming family. She'd come to Pattaya at 19 looking for work, had spent several years in the karaoke industry. She told me this plainly, without elaboration, looking directly at me as she said it, which I took as a sign of honesty, and had left that life 5 years ago. She was now waitressing while saving to take a business course. She sent money home to her mother every month. She spoke of her background without self-pity and without asking for sympathy, which was a combination I found striking. Women who had been through difficult things and carried themselves without visible damage were, in my experience, either genuinely strong or extremely good at concealment. I believe she was the former. I think about that moment now, and I think about the fact that she told me about the karaoke work immediately and without prompting. At the time, I took it as evidence of her openness. Looking back, I wonder whether it was the opposite. Whether disclosing the thing you expect someone to find difficult, disclosing it early and calmly, is a way of taking it off the table, of making it a dealt-with fact rather than an ongoing question. I don't know. I'll never know. But I've thought about it. By July, we were spending most evenings together. She had a room she rented in a shared house near the South Pattaya bus station, and I had my apartment near Jomtien, and there was a natural rhythm established where she'd come over after her shift and we'd cook or watch Thai television with subtitles. I was making a genuine effort with the language, using an app every morning for an hour, managing by August to hold basic conversations about food and directions and the weather. I was happy in a way that felt almost suspicious, as though happiness at 66, after everything I'd been through, required some justification I hadn't yet provided. I told myself I was just glad to be somewhere warm, with someone who made the evenings feel inhabited rather than empty. She cooked on the weekends, mostly Isan food, lob, grilled pork with sticky rice, spicy soups she made from ingredients I couldn't have named, dishes that required a kind of focused preparation I found meditative to watch. She'd set up in my small kitchen with complete unself-consciousness, moving around the space with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a great deal of her life making do with limited equipment, and the apartment would fill with smells that were entirely unlike anything I'd grown up with in Wolverhampton, and that I came to associate, in a way that has outlasted everything else, with the feeling of being genuinely at home somewhere. I know that sounds strange given how this ended, but the feeling was real, and I don't think pretending otherwise would be honest. She mentioned her background in small installments over those early months, not as confessions but as context, offered plainly in the same way she'd offered the karaoke disclosure at the very beginning. Her father had been a rice farmer in Buriram, who died when she was 14, leaving her mother to raise 8 children largely alone. She was the 5th child and the first to leave for the city, at 19, with a small amount of cash and the address of a cousin in Bang Lamung. She described the arc of her history in a tone that was, if anything, slightly matter-of-fact, as though she'd made peace with the facts of her own life long ago, and found other people's interest in them somewhat beside the point. I found this profoundly appealing. Christine had been a woman of deep feeling, and I had loved her completely for it, but I was 66, and tired in ways I hadn't fully named, and something about Kratae's even quality felt, at that stage of my life, like exactly the right kind of person to be near. She introduced me to her colleague Mali in August, a woman she'd worked with at the restaurant who had grown up in the same province, and the 3 of us had dinner one evening at a seafood place on the beach road near Naklua. At one point, Mali pulled me gently aside while Kratae was in the bathroom and said, In careful English, she is good person, but she has had hard time. She needs someone kind. I took that as an endorsement. Looking back, I'm not certain that's what it was. In September, I met a British man named Stuart at the Expat social event, a pub near the Pattaya bus terminal, ran on Thursday evenings. Stuart was 63, had lived in Pattaya for 7 years, and had what I can only describe as a battlefield education in the dynamics of the place. He was pleasant company and not unkind, but he was the sort of man whose experience had calcified into general rules. And within 20 minutes of my mentioning Kratae, he was telling me the rules. Former karaoke girl, he said. Not unkindly, but not gently either. Look, Tom, I'm not saying she's not lovely. She might be completely lovely. But the ones who've worked that industry, they understand money in a particular way. They understand what men will do when they feel something. And that knowledge doesn't go away just because they've changed jobs. I nodded and said I took his point. I did take his point. I filed it alongside Phil's warning in the previous script. No, sorry, alongside every other well-meaning warning I'd ever been given about things that turned out to be true. And I told myself my situation was specific enough to be different. The specificity I was relying on was this. Kratae had never asked me for money. Not once. She paid for meals when we went out together, which happened about half the time. She brought things to my apartment, fruit from the market, a particular biscuit she knew I liked, once a small hand-painted ceramic that she said she'd found at the night market and thought I'd appreciate. She was the least transactional person I had encountered in my time in Pattaya, and in a place where the transactional energy can be almost atmospheric, that distinction meant something to me. It still means something to me, in the complicated way things mean something when they're real, and they're also part of a picture you didn't see clearly. We were married in February 2023. The ceremony was a civil registration at the AMFO, the district office, in Banglamung, which is the administrative district covering Pattaya. Her sister Nong came down from Buriram for it, a quiet woman who spoke no English and communicated through smiles and the careful presentation of food at every available opportunity. There was a sin sod, a bride price, which Kratae's family expected, and I paid 150,000 baht, approximately 3,800 pounds at the exchange rate at the time. The amount felt reasonable, and I paid it without discussion. What happened the week after the marriage was the thing that undid everything, though I didn't understand that for another 11 months. I suggested opening a joint account at the Bangkok Bank branch in Pattaya. My reasoning was practical. I wanted her to have access to funds for household expenses without having to ask me every time. And I believed, genuinely and completely, that this was a reasonable extension of the partnership we'd built. She agreed without particular enthusiasm, which I remember now as notable, because I might have expected more enthusiasm from someone who'd supposedly been managing on a tight budget. At the time, I read it as characteristic composure. We went to the branch together on the 14th of February, which I only remember because the teller made a remark about the date, and we transferred 220,000 pounds, 11 million baht at the prevailing rate, into the joint account. I retained 70,000 pounds in my UK account. I thought of the joint account as our operational fund, the money we'd live on, and the UK amount as a reserve. She had full access to the joint account. Full access. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that follows. I'm not describing a situation where she manipulated me into giving her access. I gave her access willingly, deliberately, as an act of what I believed was love and partnership. The problem wasn't the access. The problem was what she did with it, and the fact that I didn't look. I didn't look because looking felt like the opposite of trust. This is the thing I need you to understand, because it's the specific mechanism of how the whole thing worked. I had a phone with a banking app that could show me the account balance at any time. I didn't use it. I checked perhaps once a month to satisfy myself that the number was roughly where I'd expect it to be given our living expenses. Our living expenses were not extravagant. Rent on the Jomtien apartment, food, occasional trips, the usual costs of two people living modestly in a Thai coastal city. I estimated we were spending perhaps 60,000 baht a month, which was comfortably covered by my pension income. I did not, in 11 months, sit down and actually reconcile the account against those estimates. I trusted the rough figure. I trusted her. I did not look closely. Looking back, and I've spent a great deal of time looking back, because there isn't much else to do at 68 when you're in the situation I'm now in. The signs were present from early spring. March, I think, though it might have been late February. She started leaving the apartment in the evenings sometimes, after dinner, citing reasons that were individually unremarkable. Her friend was unwell and needed company. Her sister had called and she wanted to speak privately. She needed to pick something up from a colleague. Each occasion was no more than 2 or 3 hours, and she was always back before midnight, and she always told me where she was going, and I always believed her without question, because questioning her felt like the same violation as looking too closely at the bank account. Questioning her felt like announcing I didn't trust her. I didn't want to announce that because I did trust her. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but she started carrying cash. Not large amounts, or at least not visible large amounts, but she stopped using her bank card for small purchases the way she had before. She'd stop at an ATM in a way that hadn't been her habit previously. I noticed this the way you notice things that don't quite fit. A brief snagging sensation that passes before you've properly registered it. I told myself she simply preferred cash for the market. Lots of people do. In April, her mother needed money. This was the first direct financial request in our relationship, and it came in the form of a call from Buriram that Kratae took in the kitchen, while I was watching television in the sitting room. When she came back, she sat down next to me, and she didn't ask immediately. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was sometimes quiet, the way I'd always found peaceful rather than unsettling. Then she said her mother's roof had been damaged in a storm, and the repair was 60,000 baht. She said she didn't want to ask me, but she didn't have the money herself. I transferred it the next morning. It was about 1,500 pounds, and I thought nothing of it whatsoever. In June, I noticed the account balance was lower than I'd expected. I'd glanced at it on the app. Not a thorough review, just a glance. And the number was smaller than my rough estimate suggested it should be. I raised this with Kratae over dinner, as casually as I could manage, and she said there had been some additional costs she'd been dealing with. A deposit on a new phone after her old one broke, some things for the apartment that I'd apparently not noticed, a contribution to her friend's medical expenses that she hadn't mentioned because she knew I'd say it was too much. The explanation was complete and plausible, and touched on things that were largely true. I had noticed a new phone. There had been a small lamp purchased for the bedroom, and I accepted it and did not look again for 6 weeks. The rainy season arrived in June and changed the texture of Pattaya in ways I hadn't experienced before. The heat became heavier and wetter. The streets sometimes flooded in the afternoons, and the city contracted somewhat. Fewer tourists on the beach road, quieter restaurants, a general slowing. Kratae was out more evenings. The reasons remained individually plausible. I was aware, at some level I wasn't willing to name, that a pattern was forming that I didn't want to examine too directly. Stuart found me at the Thursday pub evening in July and asked how married life was treating me. I said, "Very well." He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was not unkind and said, "You look tired, Tom." I told him I was sleeping fine. He said, "That's not what I mean." I changed the subject. He didn't push it. He was too experienced a man in that place to push it. There was a night in August. The rainy season was still heavy. The sound of it on the balcony was the sound I associate most strongly with that period, constant and enveloping, when Kratae came home at midnight smelling of cigarettes. She didn't smoke. I knew she didn't smoke because in over a year of knowing her I had never seen her with a cigarette, and she'd told me once that she'd tried it at 18 and couldn't stand it. She said she'd been at a friend's place, and the friend's husband smoked indoors. I looked at her, and she looked back at me with an expression that was, and I have replayed this many times, perfectly calm, not defensive, not evasive, calm. I said okay, and we went to bed, and I lay in the dark for 2 hours and did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, card rooms. Pattaya has a certain culture of informal gambling. Underground card rooms mostly, operating out of residential buildings or the back sections of shops. Illegal, but tolerated in the pragmatic way that certain things in Thailand are illegal but tolerated. I knew they existed because Stuart had mentioned them once in passing. Something about a bloke he'd known who'd lost 50,000 baht in a weekend. I hadn't thought about them in relation to Kratae at all until that night, lying in the dark with the rain on the balcony. And then I thought about the evening absences, and the cash at the ATM, and the cigarette smell, and the account balance that had been lower than expected, and the thought arrived fully formed and sat in my chest like a weight. I did not ask her about it. I want to be honest about that. I thought about asking her, in the dark, for about 2 hours, and I chose not to, because asking felt like accusing, and accusing felt like the end of something I still didn't want to lose. So I chose not to look, again. I made the same choice I'd been making for months, the choice that was costing me everything. I didn't know the scale yet. I knew something was wrong, and I chose, deliberately, not to find out what. That is the hardest part of this to explain to people. Because from the outside it looks like stupidity or cowardice. And maybe it was both. But from the inside it felt like loyalty. It felt like being the kind of man who doesn't give up on people at the first sign of difficulty. It wasn't the first sign. I know that now. In September, her cousin needed money for a debt repayment, 80,000 baht, or faced serious consequences from the man he owed. The cousin was named Dang, and I had met him once, briefly, at a gathering at Kratae's friend's apartment in South Pattaya. He'd seemed like a pleasant enough young man, and the situation, as Kratae described it, sounded genuinely dangerous. I transferred the money. 80,000 baht was about 2,000 pounds, and it was, I told myself, a one-time emergency in a family that didn't have the resources to absorb emergencies. I told myself this was what family meant. There was also a smaller request in October, 30,000 baht for Kratae's younger sister, who was trying to complete a vocational qualification and needed to pay the examination fees. This wasn't framed as an emergency, just as a thing that would help a young woman who was trying to improve her situation, and in those terms I found I couldn't reasonably object. 30,000 baht was less than 800 pounds. I didn't think about it for more than a day. I remember that particular evening in September very clearly, though not for any significant reason. We'd had Khao Man Gai, poached chicken rice, from a place near the apartment that we both liked, and we ate it on the balcony while a dog somewhere below barked in a rhythmic, persistent way that eventually stopped. I remember thinking that I was content. I remember the specific quality of that contentment, not excitement, not the charged feeling of something new, but the quieter satisfaction of a life that had found its shape. It was September, and the rain was lighter, and the evenings were starting to cool slightly, and I was 67 years old, and I had, sitting across from me, a woman who knew how I took my tea, and who occasionally, without ceremony, reached across and put her hand on mine. I did not know that I had, at that point, somewhere in the region of 60,000 pounds left in the joint account. I did not know that the account had been going down, consistently and in carefully sized withdrawals, for 6 months. The thing about not looking is that it protects you from information you don't want and gives the problem time to become much larger. I understand this now in a way that feels obvious and that felt, at the time, like trust. I had the banking app on my phone. I checked it, as I said, perhaps once a month, satisfying myself with the rough figure. A rough figure that had been declining for months at a rate I would have found alarming if I'd actually tracked it. But I didn't track it. I glanced, registered that money remained, and closed the app and went back to being content on the balcony with Kratae and the dog that eventually stopped barking. The ATM was on a Tuesday in January 2024. I'd been to the macro near Sukhumvit Road to buy a few household things, and on the way back I stopped at a Bangkok Bank machine near the 7-Eleven on the corner of our street because I wanted 2,000 baht for the small purchases I tended to make in cash. I put my card in. I entered my PIN. I pressed the button for 2,000 baht, and the machine declined the transaction. I pressed again, thinking there might have been a processing error. It declined again. I pressed the button for the balance inquiry and waited. The balance was 14,322 baht. I stood at the ATM for what I think was a long time. I'm not sure how long. I know that a woman with a small child tried to come past me at some point, and I stepped aside automatically, without really registering her. I know the afternoon traffic on the road behind me was the particular sound of late afternoon in Pattaya. Motorbikes, the occasional tuk-tuk, music from a shop. I know I looked at the number on the screen for long enough that the machine timed out and returned my card. 14,322 baht. At the exchange rate at the time, this was approximately 310 pounds. In the account, I had deposited 220,000 pounds 11 months earlier. I think I need to say something here about the specific quality of that moment, because I've tried to describe it to people since, and found myself unable to fully convey it. It wasn't panic. Panic involves movement, elevated heart rate, urgency, the impulse to do something. What I felt was much quieter than that. It was something closer to the sensation of stepping onto solid ground and finding it wasn't there. The whole structure of the last year, the trust, the evenings, the contentment on the balcony, the cowman guy, the rain, all of it shifted into a new configuration in the space of a few seconds. And the new configuration included a version of me standing at an ATM on a Tuesday afternoon in Pattaya, having handed over 220,000 pounds to a woman who had lost it, or spent it, or hidden it, in 11 months. I walked home. I don't remember making the decision to walk home rather than do anything else, but I did. I let myself into the apartment. I sat down on the sofa, and then I opened the banking app properly, for the first time, and I looked at the transaction history. There were ATM withdrawals, hundreds of them. Going back to March, the pattern was consistent, between 2 and 5 withdrawals per week, most of them for 10,000 baht, some for 20,000, a few for 30,000. The amounts were large enough to accumulate rapidly, and small enough that none of them individually would have struck me as alarming if I'd been checking regularly, which I hadn't. Between March and January, 10 months, the withdrawal pattern accounted for approximately 8 million baht. At the exchange rate across that period, roughly 200,000 pounds. There were also the transfers I'd authorized, the roof repair, the cousin's debt, which accounted for another 140,000 baht, and the normal household expenditure, which I could identify from the supermarket and utility transactions, which looked entirely ordinary and totaled roughly what I'd expected. She had withdrawn, in cash, over 10 months, the equivalent of nearly 200,000 pounds, cash, from ATMs, in amounts carefully calibrated to be individually unremarkable. I sat there on the sofa with the app open and scrolled through every transaction, and I felt the specific, irreversible quality of something that cannot be taken back. Kratae came home at 6 in the evening. I was still on the sofa with the phone in my hand. She came in, set down her bag, looked at me, and whatever she saw in my expression made her stop very still in the doorway to the kitchen. I showed her the phone. I didn't say anything. I held it up so she could see the screen. She looked at it for a moment. She didn't cry. She didn't become angry or defensive, not immediately. She sat down in the chair across from me with the controlled movement of someone who has, perhaps, been waiting for this moment. And then she said, "I know. I'm sorry, Thomas." That was all she said for about a minute. I asked her where it had gone. She was quiet. I asked again. She said she had a problem. She said it started before we met. She'd had debts from her time in the karaoke industry, money she owed to people she'd borrowed from when she was first trying to leave that life. And when we married and the account was opened, she'd used some of it to clear those debts. But it hadn't stopped there. She said she'd started going to a card room in South Pattaya, near the Soi Buakau area, a regular game, cards, stakes she'd thought she could manage. She said it began as a way of trying to win back what she'd taken. She said she knew that wasn't rational. She said she couldn't stop. She said she'd been going 4, sometimes 5 nights a week, from April onward. She said she'd won occasionally, enough to believe each time that the next session would fix everything. It hadn't. I asked her how much she'd lost at the card room specifically. She said she couldn't calculate it precisely. The original debts from before we met had been approximately 400,000 baht. The card room losses across 10 months were somewhere between 7 and 8 million baht. She wasn't certain of the exact figure because she hadn't kept records. I asked her whether she'd had any intention of telling me. She said she'd told herself repeatedly that she would tell me after the next win, that she was going to fix it first, Then she would tell me. I didn't shout. I want to tell you that I shouted, because that would be the human, understandable response that this story seems to require. But I didn't. I sat very quietly with 220,000 pounds of my life's work gone across a card table in South Pattaya, and I asked her whether there was anything left that could be recovered. She said no. I asked her if there was any way to pursue the card room operators. Illegal premises, surely some accountability. She said the men who ran it were not the kind of men who provided receipts or appeared in court. I asked her what she wanted to do now. She said she didn't know. I said I thought she should leave that evening. She said okay. She packed a bag and she was gone within an hour. Stuart came round the next morning, which tells you something about how quickly news travels in a community of that size and disposition. He sat in my kitchen and drank tea, and did not say I told you so, which I appreciated deeply. What he said instead was, "Have you called Lisa?" I hadn't called anyone. He told me to call Lisa. He stayed while I did. Lisa was calm, in the way Lisa is calm, which is to say that the calm was effortful and visible, and a gift she was giving me deliberately. She said we'd sort it out. She said I should come home. I told her I couldn't come home. Not immediately, not like that. She said she understood, but she wanted me to come home eventually. I said I knew. She asked about the Thai authorities, about any possibility of legal action. I told her I'd consult a lawyer. The lawyer, a Thai English solicitor named Kun Wichai, who practiced in Pattaya and came recommended by the British consulate's informal advice line, was direct in a way I found less devastating than I might have a week earlier, because by that point, I was beginning to adjust to the territory of lost causes. He explained that the account was a joint account, that Kratae had as much legal standing to make withdrawals as I did, and that absent evidence of fraud, defined in a specific legal sense that her transparent, to him, in the transaction pattern, but technically legitimate withdrawals did not meet. Recovery through the Thai legal system was unlikely. The cardroom operators were beyond the reach of civil pursuit for obvious reasons. The money was gone in a legal sense as completely as it was gone in a practical one. I sat with a notepad in my flat and I wrote down the numbers. Joint account deposit, 220,000 pounds. Account balance on discovery, 310 pounds. Effectively zero. Personal transfers I'd authorized across the marriage, 6,200 pounds. Total loss, 226,200 pounds approximately. I had 70,000 pounds remaining in my UK account. I had my pension income of 1,410 pounds a month. I had a return flight to Wolverhampton that I booked on a Thursday in February, 3 weeks after the ATM, after the lawyer, after the very particular quality of silence that descends on a man when he has been through all the stages of a thing and arrived at the part where there's nothing left to do but go. I want to say something about Kratae that is true even though it makes the story more complicated. I believe she had a genuine addiction. I don't say this to excuse what she did, because what she did was take 200,000 pounds from a 67-year-old widower who trusted her completely and gamble it away over 10 months without once telling him what was happening. That is not excusable. But I also don't think she planned it from the beginning the way a con artist plans. The debts from before were real, I believe that. The spiral that followed was real. The compulsion that kept her returning to a room in South Pattaya 4 nights a week, believing each time that the next hand would fix everything. I think that was real too. Real and catastrophic and, for me, irrelevant in terms of outcome. The money was gone whether she'd been calculated or compulsive. My financial security at 68 was gone either way. The departure was quiet. I packed 2 bags, left the furniture, which I'd bought and which she was welcome to, because I didn't have any more energy to assign ownership to things, and I took a minibus to Suvarnabhumi Airport on a Sunday morning in late February. I remember the road out of Pattaya, the Gulf Coast visible through the window, the water flat and gray in the early morning light. I'd loved that view when I first arrived. I still found it beautiful. That was the worst part, oddly. That Thailand was still beautiful. That the thing I'd come for was real. And the thing that had destroyed me was also real. And the two of them had existed in the same place at the same time, and I had only ever been able to see one of them clearly. I'm back in Wolverhampton. I live in a two-bedroom house I'm renting from a letting agency on the Bilston Road, about half a mile from the street I grew up on, which I find either meaningful or a particularly cruel joke, depending on the day. I have £70,000 in my UK account, and my pension income of £1,410 a month, and no particular plan beyond the next few months. Lisa found the letting agency, filled out half the paperwork, drove me to collect the keys on a Saturday in March, and then took me to a Wetherspoons for lunch and talked to me about her daughter's nursery with determined cheerfulness. I will never be able to properly repay Lisa for those weeks, not because of the logistics, but because of the quality of attention she brought to them, the way she stayed on topic, never made me explain myself, never said anything that required me to perform being all right when I wasn't. At 68, with no property and no capital beyond what's in that account, rebuilding is not really the word for what I'm doing. Managing is more accurate. Getting through. Taking it a day at a time in the way that people take things a day at a time, when the alternative is looking at the full picture and finding it unbearable. I worked with my hands for 31 years. I supervised a production line that turned raw steel into components that went into vehicles that are still on the road somewhere, driven by people who have no idea where the parts came from. There is something I feel about that work that I can't quite name, but it's something in the vicinity of pride. And what I feel about the £226,000 that represented the financial reward for that work is something I also can't quite name, but it sits in the opposite direction from pride. Lisa comes round on Sundays. She brings her husband and my granddaughter, who is 4, and whose primary interest in me is that I'm willing to read the same book about a bear multiple times in succession without apparent frustration. I read it as many times as she asks. It's a good book. It's a simple story about something small that gets frightening and then gets better, and the bear finds her way home, and everything is all right. I know that's not how things always work, but I read it every time she hands it to me. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Trust is not an attitude you adopt toward a person. It's a structure you build with them, together, over time, with transparency running in both directions. What I practiced in Pattaya was not trust. It was avoidance dressed up as trust. The active choice not to look, not to ask, not to engage with information that might have disrupted something I needed to believe. I didn't trust Kratae. I deferred to her. There is a difference that cost me £226,000 to understand, and I wish with everything I have that I'd understood it earlier. If you're going to share a bank account with a partner, anywhere, not just Thailand, but especially in a situation where you are a long way from home and your normal support structures and your normal instincts about when something is wrong, build in a process. Monthly statement review together. Agreed spending thresholds above which you both discuss before acting. Not because you don't trust the person, because transparency isn't the enemy of trust. It's the condition that makes trust something more than wishful thinking. A joint account is not a gift. It's a shared responsibility. Treat it accordingly. And if someone you love is coming home at unusual hours, and the cash is disappearing in amounts you can't account for, and you notice things that don't quite fit but explain them away, because asking feels like accusing, ask anyway. A question asked calmly and from a place of care is not an accusation. It's information gathering. It's the basic minimum of engagement with your own financial reality. I was so committed to not being the kind of man who checks up on his wife that I became the kind of man who lost everything. I want to be honest about Kratae in a way that complicates the story but is true. I believe she had a real addiction. The pattern of the withdrawals, steady, compulsive, continuing even as the balance fell toward nothing, is consistent with someone who cannot stop rather than someone executing a plan. I believe the original debts from before we met were genuine. I believe the card room in South Pattaya was real, and that she went back to it 4 and 5 nights a week for 10 months, telling herself each time that this session would fix what the last session had broken. I don't say any of this to make what she did acceptable. It isn't acceptable. Taking £200,000 from a widower who trusted you completely and destroying his financial security is not acceptable regardless of the psychological mechanism behind it. But I also think the truth is that she was not a con artist in the premeditated sense. She was a person with a destructive compulsion who made choices that destroyed two people, herself and me, and who may not, even now, fully understand the weight of what those choices cost. If you're thinking of going to Thailand as a retiree, if you've got a pension and a redundancy payout, and a sense that the remaining years of your life could look different from the years that came before, hear me. Thailand can be exactly what it promises. The cost of living, the climate, the warmth of the culture, the food, the mornings on a balcony when the sea is visible and the coffee is good, and the day feels genuinely open. These things are real. I'm not standing here to tell you it was all a lie. It wasn't. But the things that make it wonderful are the same things that make it risky for a man in the position I was in. The difference between what you bring and what the people around you have. The power that difference quietly confers on the person you're closest to. The distance from your normal reality that makes it easier to not look too carefully at things you should examine. Know that coming in, have the conversation about money early and directly. Maintain oversight without apology. I've thought about whether there was a moment I could point to where the right question, asked clearly, would have changed the outcome. I keep arriving at March, the first night she came home smelling of cigarettes. If I'd asked directly, calmly, without accusation, if I'd said simply, I need to understand what's happening in the evenings, something feels different, and I'd rather talk about it than not, the story might have been different. Not fixed, maybe, but different. The thing was already in motion by March. But earlier information is earlier options, and earlier options are sometimes better ones. I didn't ask. I made the choice I made, every time, to extend the trust without asking for the information that would have made the trust mean something real. And so here I am, on the Bilston Road, 68 years old, reading about a bear who finds her way home. I don't know how my story ends yet. I genuinely don't know.